Hi, I'm Wayne Tuttle, and welcome to Chasing Legends. Welcome back, I'm Wayne Tuttle, once again your host for another week of Chasing Legends. Please go down, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, go to the About section, tell you all about the channel, and there you can find represent.com. You can see our t-shirts, you can see our coffee cups, you can see everything we got there to offer. We're not really making anything off of it, but the shirts, gray and black, long sleeve, short sleeve, cool, Legend of the Superstition Mountains, Dutch Hunter Rendezvous. Same goes kind of for the cups, except they just come in one color. So anyhow, and look forward here shortly to see our new website, because we're going to have a website so you can link to all the other stuff, whether it's Instagram or Facebook or YouTube, and it'll have additional content, you know, photographs and stuff and other material and stuff, and links to other people, the people that are kind of part of the Legend of the Superstition Mountains family, like Tom Collenborn and Jack Sanfelice and other people, where to find their books and so forth. That being said and done, thank you for joining us. Leave us a comment if you want to. This week, we're going to go a little bit off the normal beaten path, which we've done a few times, but in doing so, it'll stick with the treasure hunting thing, and it'll be a story for a lot of people, which they're pretty familiar with. Some people won't. As usual, you can go out there and find a little bit of information on the web, or some interview and some material, and there are some blogs, vlogs, and videos concerning some of the stuff, a few interview videos. But primarily my source material was the book, The Gold House, which I've talked about. This is the first book. It's a 3-book series. The first book is The Gold House, The Discovery by John Clarence with Tom Whittle. Difficult book to find. It's the story of Milton Doc Noss. And generally most people hear of it and they know it as the Victorio Peak treasure in New Mexico. And I'll kind of do a rundown. I'm not going to be historically dates and times and places, because we're not going to spend an hour and a half doing just kind of a little bit of review. The book is very difficult because it kind of jumps around. It tries to do things chronologically, but it makes a lot of references. What I did with the book, which is probably close to 400 to 500 pages. So I'd read a chapter, I would go back, and I would read the chapter again, skim back over it, and try to get things set. The first book tries to deal with stuff that's in the second and third book. So it gets kind of like a little bit out of place, and you're trying to get back to the story. It takes a while for the story actually to settle in from the beginning. The story most people know, they think of when Milton Noss, known as Doc Noss, who was not a licensed doctor, but he did perform podiatry. He had an office, treated people for foot ailments, and his wife, Ova. And they were out deer hunting with some friends, two other couples, and then they were out by the Victorio Peak area, and he ends up on Victorio Peak while they're deer hunting, and he finds this entrance. So we're going to go back a little, because the story actually kind of goes back quite a bit earlier, because that happens, I believe, around 1934 or so, when they discover that. But the story actually kind of begins around 1929, 1930. What happens is two gentlemen, Willie Dothit and Buster Ward, whose name is Robert Ward, but we'll use Buster because he's not the same Robert Bob Ward that we know in the Superstitions. They discover a thing called the Stovepipe Cave. This is near the town of, I think, what is it called? Hot Springs, which is now Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. Interesting story almost in itself, right? If you ever remember the TV show, which many of you may, some of you may have never heard of this, there was a show called Truth or Consequences, and they offered to do a show from a town that would rename itself Truth or Consequences. That's how Truth or Consequences, New Mexico got its name. They got rid of the old name and took the new name to have the show kind of there. Anyways, so Willie and Buster are out the spot. Supposedly there was a young kid who discovered the map in this old cabin, and he had located this cave. And in the cave there's gold bars. So Willie finds it, Buster does. They get some gold, and they're trying to sell gold at the time, which was legal at that time. But they're kind of like shady guys and sketchy guys. But they finally locate this supposedly, and we don't have any confirmation, but it's believed they killed the young man who had the map, and that's how they discover the cave. There's an old cabin down by the site, has an old piece of like coffee can there that shows which direction it would be, and a lot of people have searched for it, haven't found the entrance. There's a number of different people involved in this whole story, but they found a cave of bars. Okay, so it's supposed to be, I think it's a vertical shaft. You go down and then you crawl a ways, and there's an opening area. Supposedly be 3 or 4 or 5 bodies in there. The young man was considered one of them. I can't imagine what that place would smell like over time as they were doing this, but supposedly they were lifting and pulling gold bars out of there. Kind of pretty well documented because both of them did quite well in life later. I believe it was Willie, I think it was, that changed his name and went under an alias and all, and talked about it. He wouldn't reveal the location of the cave, but he talked about it, and his son was going to inherit what he had still and all, but they did get gold out of there. One of the things that was happening was in 1934, Roosevelt, I believe it was Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, decided to do what was called the Gold Reserve Act, which meant it was illegal for you or I or anyone privately to own gold. So up to a certain amount, and then you'd have to sell it to the government. And that was the whole basis and the idea of building Fort Knox and gold, the gold standard and so forth from that time, which ran up until the presidency of Richard Nixon. So they were trying to get rid of the gold because of this coming and happening. Willie, in a kind of unrelated thing, they were trying to do one deal, and they were trying to get away from some guys that were trying to kidnap them and steal the gold from them. And Willie went under a train car and lost his legs. Now he got artificial limbs and was actually able to ride a horse and live for quite a while later. But it's an interest because there's newspaper stories documenting that they were trying to sell gold, and that he, in fleeing, had fallen the railroad tracks under a train and all this. So we have a kind of a definitively kind of a true story attached to it, at least documentation talking at that time and era. Well, there's 2 other gentlemen that come into the area, searching in the area, and this is near, I'm trying to think, it's like, is it the Caballo Mountains or something like that? It's quite some distance from Victorio Peak. But one of them is a man named Milton Noss, who had been working out of hot springs in a number of areas, treating people's feet. And he had a Yaqui Indian individual, Tony Carriaga. And they discovered another cave in the area that had gold bars. And the 2 of them were taking those gold bars out and burying them in various places and hiding them. Interesting note, even in the book, is Tony Carriaga is not really mentioned that often. He kind of jumps in and out of the story. He wasn't that involved, even though he did show up and was around the Victorio Peak. He must have taken the gold he had and found ways to live off of it and kind of disappear. They're still trying to figure out, what do we do with all this gold? Now, Doc Noss was known to be a drinker. He got drunk a lot. He'd go into town, get drunk, and assault people. He would beat deputy sheriffs, chief of police. It didn't matter to him. He was a brawler, and because of this, he was in and out of jail all the time for disturbing the police. He, in fact, spent some time in prison over it. But after all this, he gets out. He finds his wife, Ova. They get married. They're out with these friends out near Victoria Peak. Now, Doc Noss has several variations of the story. One of them is that he was actually either half or 3/4, I believe it was Cheyenne. And he ran away from home, away from his stepfather, who he said was quite cruel, and he ended up in Oklahoma, but he wasn't quite in the reservation, and he didn't seem to fit in either or. So he was around everyone at the reservation in Fort Sill and these different areas, but he wasn't quite living as a white man, and he wasn't quite living as an Indian, as a Cheyenne. But he claims he met Geronimo during that period. And Geronimo told him about these treasure caves and treasure troves in New Mexico, and I think Arizona as well. Well, young Milton Noss just heard those stories. Now, there's nowhere that says Geronimo told him where it was. Noss just basically said he met Geronimo. Geronimo told him about the stuff, which spurred an interest. Ovanos would say later that he actually took her to one of Geronimo's descendants, or a cousin or a daughter or son or someone, and took them to their house, and they knew who Doc was when they pulled up. They recognized him, knew who he was. They talked to them and spent some time with them. So there is kind of validity to the story, and Doc never says Geronimo told him where the treasure trove was. Just says he related him the story. Now Doc, after finding this first cave of bars of gold, wants to find the others. He doesn't want to make it public. He doesn't want to file claim or treasure trove. One thing is, that's the best way to lose it, we've noticed. The other way to lose it is not tell anybody. But he believes it has something to do with the 7 cities of gold. Not that there's 7 cities, but there's 7 caches of different places. And he believed Willie and Buster had found one, and he believed him and Tony had found one of the other ones. So he started searching and using these different material and stuff to figure out where these other locations might be. Well, they're at Victorio Peak, and the deer hunting story is somewhat true. They were out hunting deer, and Doc decided to go up the Victorio Peak, get some high ground, and then it started to rain, and he was looking for cover, and he was found a spot, and then he thought he felt like a snake or something, air moving by his leg. He looked down, and he found a hole under some rocks. So he uncovered this hole, found the hole, saw there was a ladder going in it. He went down the ladder. He came into this room, and it had paintings on the walls and all kinds of stuff, and he realized it was very old, and he was like, what the hell have I found? So he came up, kind of restacked the rocks, went down, told Ova, we got to talk, we need to go home, but we need to find a reason to go home, and then I'll tell you when we get home. So they came up with some sort of reason why after the next day or so they had to go home early and stuff from the deer hunt, and they left. The only 2 people know this. Now this is around 1933-34. So they go home, and Doc tells Ova, hey, there's this spot. I found this hole. We need to go back and check it out. So they go back to check it out. Doc goes down in. There's this long ladder, and then there's a passage in there, and it's got boulders and stuff, and there's some tight squeezes. Ova was a little bigger, and Doc said it was really physical. There was some tight squeezes. He didn't think she'd make it. Ova did go down the first couple of ladder places to where the paintings were, so she saw all that, and she described that, but she said she never went any further down than that in the original. Doc went down, and he found some stuff, and he brought a few things up, and I think one of them is a crown. He said there was boxes of stuff, and there was coins and jewels and different things and swords, and there was some skeletons. He ran into a skeleton early on, then he ran into other skeletons in other chambers. And he told her in this one area there was this huge pile of, like, it looked like pig iron, just stacked iron bars and stuff, and just old waste iron. And he didn't bother with that because it was all black and sooty and stuff, and he said he just figured it was lead or iron. But this other stuff was worth a lot of money. So I made a few trips, brought some stuff out to her, because he just couldn't get through these wedges and stuff. He could only put a few things in his pockets and stuff, and he would bring stuff up and show her. She asked him, bring up one of those bars of iron. And he's like, that's a pain, but he did it for her. So he brought one of those up. It was about 30 or 40 pounds, and he got it up, and when he finally got up the ladder and got it out, he told her that was the most difficult thing he'd ever done. He put it out there on the side of the ground, told her, I'm never going back in. There's no way you can ever get me to go back in there for it. And it was just too much. So I think then there's an old quote by him saying there's not enough gold in Fort Knox to make me go down and bring one of these bars up again. And they both told that story. Well, Ova was messing around with it and banged it on something to see kind of what was made of it all, and it got yellow. And she kept scraping it and banging, and then they realized it was like a soot or a silt that had developed over the gold bars. It was solid gold. At that point, they realized, wow, what do we have? Of course, that's when what do I do? Because he's saying there's thousands of these gold bars down there. If these are all gold, now we got to get it out. But he also realizes the problem of literally spending half a day to go all the way down into these chambers and then haul one of these up one at a time. It's just going to be an impossible task, because he's going to have to make 1,000 days of trips, several years to pull each in. And if there's 10,000 or more, how many years? 9, 10, 12 years of one bar a day. So, and it's risky, and there's all the other. So They come in, and over a period of time, this is 1934, but what happens to them, because I got to make this point, is the Gold Reserve Act happens. Well, Doc can't sell the gold. So what he would do over time is he would saw off pieces and find people that would buy some of the gold, but he would also melt parts of the bars of gold, let it drip into water, and act like it's gold nuggets and sell some of that. But he always had people kind of watching and seeing. He'd have to go all over the place to sell gold to finance their trips and stuff. So it takes a little while. They close down the podiatry place. They start letting people in on this. Now, one of the people they bring in is a woman named Merle Hortzman, and this is probably the beginning of the end of all this. Is one, Doc, if you read the book and you read it carefully, Doc Noss was pretty incredible what he could do. It was kind of like he was Indiana Jones without the brains. And he doesn't appear to be the brightest bulb, and he makes constant mistakes. It's probably why he had the kind of slight criminal element. And he was always accused of faking stuff, but there was too many people that saw actual gold bars, and we'll get to that here in a bit. But the problem is, his method is he didn't trust anybody. He'd get drunk. He'd fight with people. He just didn't have good control over the operation. And so for the next probably close to 5 or 6 years, it's off and on, he would disappear. He'd show back up. They'd have to find it. They kept bringing in different people to finance and work the operation. He had the other cave that he'd buried bars from, and what he was bringing out of Victorio Peak, he was taking out and burying in various locations. So during this time, there's two couples, and I'm going to get their names right here. It was the Lorius and Heber families from, I think, Iowa or Illinois. And they were murdered, and they found their burnt-out car, and I think they found the body of the one woman, but 3 of the others were missing. Now, whether it was Willie and Buster, remember them, or a couple guys known as the Palmer brothers, it's generally thought that Doc had nothing to do with that. But he made reference to having seen some bodies or something, the skeletons in Victorio Peak and with these other guys. Well, what happens is this woman decides, working as the secretary, is hired by Doc and Ova, starts writing everybody, and I think she's trying to cover her bases. So she's talking to the county sheriff, she's talking to local police, she's talking to anybody in the state, the county that'll listen to her, and then she ends up getting ties in with the FBI and other people in the Treasury Department. So literally, she's throwing Doc under the bus on one side, but working with him and taking notes and helping that, because she gets a 1% share of the treasure, which she constantly works out how many millions of dollars that's worth to her, like $3, $4, $5 million. So her and her husband are always dealing with that, but she's also backstabbing everybody in the process, which in turn gets the Secret Service and the Treasury Department and the FBI watching Doc, because he's supposedly selling gold and stuff, and she's trying to get him in trouble for these murders as well, like who knows what she's thinking. So she calls so much attention to it. So Doc, by dealing with the wrong people, and after finding out this woman has talked to too many people, continues to keep her on. They just continually keep collapsing everything around them. Well, Doc at one point decides to go up to the Colorado to the Mint and turn in a gold bar, and figures, well, I need money out of all this stuff. It's so difficult to get rid of it. He starts trying to finally reach out and say, okay, here's one of the gold bars, you pay me for that. Well, the Mint, because there's no stamping anything that indicates provenance on it, gives him a receipt for it for $90,000. And then they tell him he'd go away, and they will check it out and get a hold of him. They never do. Later, after Doc's death, Ova contacts and tries to deal with the Mint. First, they act like they deny he's ever been there, any of this ever happened, and then later they claim the bar was silver with just very little gold in it. So they had 2 different things, which is one of the problems. Is once the Treasury Department and those people, a gentleman named Howard, who dealt with World War II Nazi gold, once they started realizing Doc Noss might really have something, and they're listening to this Merle Hortzman, they started trying to find ways to kind of... So they would literally pull Doc Noss over, take gold bars from him, and then let him go again. He'd get thrown in jail, but they would catch whatever's in his car. And knowing that he's not going to say anything, he can't sue anybody, it's illegal to have it, this game keeps playing out. But he had gold stashed not only in the desert, but various people holding on to gold for him at banks and different places, attorneys and so forth. So what happens is eventually Doc realizes he kind of gets away from Ova, and he realizes he doesn't, this is just not going very well, too much stress. He was dealing with all the pressures. He was obviously drinking and stuff, and he leaves Ova for a period of time. She takes over the operation, and she starts, actually, Ova knows how to run a business. So she's running the crews. They're starting to dig. They're getting down in there. One of the things Doc had done is hired a mining engineer who tried to blast open the crack. And when he tried to blast it open, it actually filled in and collapsed the crack. So they were trying to clean that out again to get back into those lower chambers. So Ova's working on that. She's getting closer and closer. She accomplished more in a year or so than Doc did in 5 or 6 years. So she's working on all this. She's trying to make this kind of come true. And Doc decides we need money. So him and Ova are talking, but they're not on great terms, but they're still partners. And she's running Victorio Peak, but he gets a guy named, I think it's Charlie Ryan? Yeah, Charlie Ryan and a guy named Roscoe Parr. And they're very important because Ryan's an oil guy out of Texas. He comes out and he kind of leaves his business to deal with Doc. And Doc has all these gold bars. And Doc shows him where the bars are, and Charlie Ryan knows where they're at out there. And he says, these are the gold bars I got stashed away. Doc has them file on a lead claim, so they're going to deal with lead. And I believe this was always a cover-up to say, well, this is a lead mine, we're going to haul lead and all this stuff, but it was a cover for them to be able to move this gold. Charlie made arrangements that he'd be able to sell the gold in Mexico. So they built an airstrip out there, and they were going to bring a plane in and then fly gold out of there. It was like, I guess, a DC-3 or something. So they were going to fly a ton of this gold. There's like 110 bars buried, and Charlie Ryan was very aware, had seen them, knew where they were, and Roscoe Parr is involved in this too, and Doc is. Well, Doc starts worrying because Charlie Ryan won't give him any money up front, and Doc's starting to realize the problem with this is, okay, I'm going to give this guy all the gold, he's going to put it on a plane and run it to Mexico, and I'll never see him again. So he gets very, very nervous. So the day before this plane's supposed to come in, or a day or two, and all this is supposed to go down, Doc tries to move all the gold, but he realizes by himself he can't move 110 bars, go out there and lift all this stuff. So there's this guy had just come into town. He'd been in and through. He's an old rodeo cowboy named Tony Jolly. And Doc had run into him at the gas station, knew he was staying where he was staying, went over and asked him, you want to give me a hand, and told him what he had to do. And Tony said, yeah, sure, why not? It's an evening's worth of work. He had nothing better to do. So him and Doc take one of the trucks, because Charles Ryan owned all these vehicles, pickup truck that he bought for Doc Noss and a Jeep and stuff sitting around there. And basically, they go up in the mountains, and him and Tony Jolly, while nobody else is aware where they're at, they go out and start digging up this gold and going to various places and relocating and burying it. And Tony Jolly gets paranoid because he suddenly realizes we're burying all this. Where the hell did this come from? And he realizes Doc has a gun in the glove compartment, and he's worried that he's not going to make it. So he finally gets into a certain thing with Doc and makes sure Doc just takes him back. Jolly realizing, like, I'm not really, I'm just going to get up and get out of town. So Jolly just leaves town. We'll come back to him in a second. So the next day, Doc goes to get gas. Charlie Ryan's wanting to know where Doc was the night before and all this stuff, and everything starts to blow up. Doc goes over to Charlie Ryan's house for who knows what reason. Another big mistake. Charlie Ryan walks him in, and he has a gun. His wife's there, another individual. I think Roscoe Parr might be there. They're in the house. Next thing, all these guys are waiting on their checks from Charlie Ryan, who've been working on the lead mine. See Doc come running out. Charlie Ryan's out there, shoots him once, and Doc starts to stumble. Charlie Ryan's wife yells, shoot that son of a bitch again, kill him. And then he shoots him a second time in the head. Doc slumps over his bumper, and there's actual pictures of him slumped over the bumper. Charlie Ryan in court says, I thought he was going to the truck for his gun and he was going to shoot me. Well, he never got very far and you were shooting him, and you guys potentially, well, Charlie Ryan, great move, because now you realize later he moved the gold and nobody knows where the gold is anymore, because nobody even knows Tony Jolly exists at this time. So all this occurs. They go to court. It's funny because Doc Noss's attorney and his very close friend and business partner, who's the judge, both run the trial, find Ryan innocent, basically act like it's self-defense, even though he murdered an unarmed man in cold blood and shot him in the back. Doc Noss's record and all this, but even the witnesses all said Doc was running for his life and this guy's shooting him in the back, and they were ducking and covering, and they took off afterwards. So Ryan gets off the hook, but then he kind of disappears. Now Roscoe Parr hangs around a little and hangs with Ova still, because Ova obviously has Doc's problem of keeping Merle Hortzman and Parr and these people around. They continue to work on things, and at that point, World War II, they got all the Nazi information technology, and they open a place called White Sands Missile Range. And as they're doing this, everybody starts becoming very aware of what Doc Noss is doing and what occurred there. And Ova's trying to keep the claim, the treasure trove, and the mining claims open, and the government, the county, the state, everybody's just collapsing on her. She had a few friends, people that were helping her in the 40s, but after Doc's death and how that all goes, they literally are just closing her down bit by bit by bit, and then telling her she can't be there except for with permits and permission, and then they won't give her permits or permission, and then eventually White Sands takes the whole area over. Obviously, there's lots of gold buried out there, and plenty of people saw the gold. So it's one of those stories where you want to say there's about 30% of it. It could even be 40 is bullshit. But there's a lot of real stuff in there and meat. One of the problems comes to, we talked earlier about Willie and Buster having gold and retiring and disappearing and changing their names. Well, Tony Jolly came out many, many years later and did interviews, and you can probably find them on YouTube. And Tony talks about how he went back out, and it took him quite a while. He went out and looked, tried to metal detect for the gold. Then he had to get a different metal detector because it was the wrong type. And he went out, and then he finally found, I think it was 10 bars, and he retired off that. He had an attorney friend that helped him move the gold, and he was able to retire, and he was able to, because he had a lot of debts at the time. And he said he only went back to do it because he had a lot of debts and stuff, and he kind of thought he might be able to find some of it. So he pulled out one of the caches and said, yeah, I did very well. He said, so he's another route. Now, nobody knew the story of Tony Jolly. If Tony Jolly would have stuck around in town, it's doubtful the court case would have changed, and things might have been rough for Tony Jolly because people would have realized he knew where some of the gold was. And that's kind of the first stage of the Doc Noss Victorio Peak treasure. Ova Noss and her family continued. It goes in where the government continued to step down. I know Ova Noss at one point goes in to see the commander at the White Sands Missile Range, and he has a map behind his desk, and Victorio Peaks circled in red. So they were very aware, going in, making sure they were keeping her out, starting to go in. Some people believe they pulled a lot out. They got as much as they could because they had found another opening. Ova Noss, Doc told her about another opening, and she was suspected it. He told her there's another way in, but I've just never told anybody. So they were kind of starting to work on that, but they were also working on the original thing. Ova goes out shortly after Doc dies and suddenly finds they've put metal grates on everything and locked everything, so she can't even get access to the areas she wanted to work. So the military worked against her, and this goes into many other groups such as Lyndon Johnson, John Kennedy supposedly knew, and Dwight Eisenhower and Nixon and all this, and there's a lot of politics later. But we're dealing with that early story. And it's very interesting. If you can get the book, The Gold House, it is a good read because they put a ton of documentation in it. Now, you also realize it's one of the problems with the whole story is the people involved. They were not the people. If they would have got one good attorney, one good mining engineer, a lot of it would have been resolved. One really smart person involved, but Doc did not trust anyone in the government because every time he did, he got burned. And they started distrusting more and more, and they kept bringing the wrong element. When you're in that sketchy kind of element, you keep bringing more sketchy element people, which was one of their problems ultimately. And it was kind of shame how everything transpired. But you can kind of see it as you read the book. You know, even though if you know the end of the story, you kind of see where it's going. Because everyone's just making one bad decision after another bad decision and another bad decision. Now, there's a lot I left out because it's obviously a lot of information in this book. And this is first of 3 books concerning that whole thing. The next 2 talk about the government removing the gold and a lot of the problems. They did let Ova and a lot of people that said they had claims back in, but at that point they returned to Victorio Peak, and there's like huge roads everywhere and ramparts and landings. The military had been in there doing extensive work. In fact, if you go to Google Maps, Google Earth, and you look at it, you'll see all these roads that they carved and cut in for access for heavy duty equipment and stuff. Now, there are also military individuals that worked at White Sands that claim to have gotten in and seen some of it and had different access points. And that's not the story we're telling. We're trying to tell the beginning, the basis of this. So it's basically Willie and Buster and theirs, and then it's Tony and Doc Noss, and then it moves into Victorio Peak. Who knows how many other places would be out there. Most people know the locations and physical locations. You really can't go out to White Sands now. The ranch is all shut down. You can't go out there. It's a very restricted area. There's not much you can do. So a good book to pick up if you can find it. If you can read all 3 books, take your time with it. It's one of those stories kind of like the Lost Dutchman. If you go into Wikipedia and you go into the internet and into forums and all these people's diluted and changed stories and some of these very small produced printed books, you're going to get yourself all over the place. I gave you really the basic idea of the story and how it was documented, but most of everything I was was documented. I don't know what happened to Tony Karangi or Kariagi, the Yaqui Indian guy. I was kind of interested in that aspect of the story because he had to know a lot of where everything was and what happened with things. But he seems to be very minimized. I don't know if the family had any contact, or perhaps he's doing very well and everything's good for him and they just left him out to some degree so people can't find him or bother him, much like Willie and Buster and some of the other people that kind of disappeared or went off the radar because they had their gold. So there are tons of gold out there, including those people that were murdered, supposedly, which it could have been Willie and Buster, but it also might have been, there was a group, I can't remember what their name was, the Palmer brothers. I didn't even need to look, and I don't even have it written down. But the Palmer brothers were thought to be possibly involved with that and might have accomplished that because they interacted with those people that were murdered, and they may have found another source or site or something to do with it. So the fact that all these different people buried gold bars and had these different caves says there was a lot that happened out there. So it's not just Victorio Peak. The Victorio Peak story reaches out to a number of different areas in that region, in that basin. And whether it has anything to do with Chief Victorio or the Spanish, or has something to do with the Jesuits, or even some people believe it had to do with Nazi World War II gold, which Doc Noss was in there and actually producing gold before World War II, so that doesn't make sense. But Howard at the Treasury there was a lot of missing gold at World War II that wasn't recovered, and that might have been a place they tried to store it as well. I've met a lot of people, had a lot of interest in the story. Like I said, there's other videos and detailed interviews and stuff. I tried to keep it kind of there and kind of what I thought, but it's an interesting story to follow up. If you don't know about it, New Mexico, it's very cool. If you go out there to poke around, hopefully you don't get yourself in too much trouble. I've dealt with a couple people that say they know where these other access points are, but there's just no way to get in, and I've tried to find if I could pull some strings to get just out there physically to kind of walk up into the site to see where they said these access points are. No luck so far. It would be cool. Make these videos, you know, hey, have our own little production studio and stuff, right? So having all those gold bars. 40-pound bars, though, that'd be a lot to haul out and a lot to explain. Just having a handful. So there you go. There it is. The Gold House, Victorio Peak, Milton Doc Noss, Ova Noss. That story gets you started. Kind of something to think about, research, kind of look into. It's one of those things. I like to look at some of these other treasure stories and kind of get in depth. The problem, that's almost like a Superstition Mountain thing. You almost literally have to make that your whole thing, because there's so much information, so much documentation, so many different areas to cover and go look at. If I'm ever in that area, I'm going to take a drive and check some of the sites out where gold was recovered, where some of the caves were, and some of the rock houses, because I'd like to see them to put them in perspective. I've seen them on Google Maps, but it'd be nice to have my feet on the ground and see where Tony Jolly pulled the gold from and these different things, to put that in real life. But very cool story. So I hope everybody enjoyed that this week. Kind of tried to remember 400 or 500 pages, and then after kind of going through it, and I had to take a couple notes because the names and everything gets tricky. And like I said, sorting it out, if you read the book, you're going to realize that I did a pretty good job of sorting that out linearly. So, but that's it. The Gold House, Victorio Peak. I hope everybody enjoyed it. I hope everybody's well. I hope they have a great rest of the week. I know we kick you off on the week, but join us again on Friday, where we're probably doing another live, and you might have some questions about this that I cannot answer. But that's cool. Last week we did answer finally. We got into the Colt Dragoons. We got into Bob Shoes' Spanish armor. And we got into, I can't remember the cabin. Whatever. But I addressed some of the questions that were kind of lying out there. And this week we didn't have too many questions to kind of address into this next week. But maybe people have some stuff there. So there you go. The treasure hunt for Victorio Peak. Again, have a great week. We will catch you next time. And always remember, I'm Wayne Tuttle. You're not. And this was Chasing Legends.